Okay, here we go. Do you see it? Okay, okay, so my plan. Okay, so my plan is I'm gonna spend like 1 hour on U.S. case and then talk about the Japanese case, which is ongoing, um, uh, for the rest of 30 minutes, and then maybe we can have an open discussion on it. Okay, so the title of the paper is called The Impact of Mask Policy Behavior on Early COVID-19 Pandemic in the US. So this is John work with Viktor Chernoskov at MIT and then my colleague at the UBC, Paul Shrimp. So in this paper, we're going to ask what is the impact of various policy adopted by the US states on the spread of COVID-19. Specifically, um, what is the impact of adopting mandatory face mask policy on case growth and death growth, and then what's the implied number of the saved lives. And along the way, we're gonna discuss how people adjust their behavior to policies, but also new information on higher transmission risk. So literature review. So there's a really limited literature review. It's just so many papers are written and then the ongoing work has been done. So I'm not gonna be able to do any justice on picking a few paper. And then in the interest of time, I'm not gonna spend much time on it either. Okay. So a few big points is that so there are many model simulations done by epidemiologists. For example, Imperial College model simulation has been very influential on the determining a policy, say, for example, in England. Okay. But those so-called SAR model, which we're going to briefly discuss later, is, let me see, do I need? Okay. So those SAR model simulation often ignore the feedback from the behavior response. Okay, as a result, that their simulated model based on the SAR model tend to have this exponential growth characteristic. But once you think about it, once as the number of cases increases, people become very risk averse because they know that there is a high risk of being infected. And then that itself is gonna partly nullify this exponential growth part of the SAR model. And that's where that I think the economists have a lot of things to contribute to our understanding of how the spread of COVID-19 happened. And then in particular, that Fernandez, Bilaver, and Jones had a very influential website talking about, well, only recently, actually, they added that by the end of May, simultaneously as we did, on taking into account of this feedback from daily deaths to the behavior. Okay. The other thing is about, so one of the main results in this paper, as we discussed, is the impact of the face mask policies. Important, so this face mask policy has been very controversial. It's not controversial in Japan, I don't think, except that Abe mask policy. But everybody, I think, agree in Japan that the face mask is important to prevent from transmitting the COVID-19. But in the US, and then to some extent in Canada, some people never believe in the face mask. And as a result, that this has been a very controversial policy. Importantly, in the medical studies, that this randomized control trial is always important in medical research, but of course there is no experimental evidence for face mask. And that's, I think that the observational study like ours and some of the ongoing work done by others are very important to make a judgment on the effectiveness of face mask. And then there is accumulating evidence that face mask is important to prevent from the COVID-19 spreading, including like Abalak, who found that the mask norm across different cross country is very important to determine the death number of deaths across different country. And then Miyazawa and Kaneko also found that the face mask wearing rate across different country had a very high explosive power on cross country deaths, number of deaths per million. Okay. All right. So contribution of this paper. So so there are many work, but there's a little bit of confusion about how to think about the impact of policy versus impact of changing the behavior. So we try to clarify how to think about how the COVID-19 spread is determined dynamically by policy and human by presenting the causal framework. It's very relatively simple framework, but I think once we come up with this, I think everything made sense. And then in particular that we think about direct versus indirect effect of policy. Some policy directly affect transmission risk, transmission rate per contact, such as mask. Mask does not necessarily affect human behavior as much, but it's going to affect the transmission probability. So that's a direct effect. But many of the lockdown policy adopted by US states are more indirect in the sense that it's going to operate through by changing the human behavior, in particular the number of contact per day, because that the people do not go out as much due to the various lockdown policy. And that itself reduces the transmission, but that's going to go through changing the behavior, changing the number of contact per day. Okay, and then another important thing we bring out is that the fact that people voluntarily adjust their behavior in response to new information on reported cases and death. Namely, when the number of cases is really, really high, people are very careful about their behavior, like more frequent washing hands, or they start even wearing masks, or they keep social distancing, or they simply do not get out of the home. Okay, and then those are the things that turns out to be very important to determine the dynamics of the spread of COVID-19. Okay, so that this naturally gives a dynamic feedback. So that we're going to present the framework to think about, relatively simple, but to capture the essence of what we think as essence of how the COVID-19 spread dynamically. We're going to present the framework, which we believe is useful to think about not only the COVID-19 spread, but also the various policy, including the economic outcome. We can extend this framework, we believe. And then based on this causal framework, we're going to present a regression analysis on how the growth rates of COVID-19 cases and deaths are determined by policies and behavior using the US state level data. Okay, and then based on the estimated model, we did the counterfactual experiment and asked, what if mandatory face mask policy had been adopted everywhere on April 1st? And then what if no stay at home or shelter in place orders? Okay. So let me start from presenting what we think as a basic framework. Okay. So we're gonna have a 5 variable. First, Y variable, okay, is the forward growth rate of case and deaths, which is a key outcome variable in this model. Okay, and then we're gonna think about how this growth rate of cases is going to be determined. So this is going to be determined partly by direct effect of policy. Okay, or maybe here I can use a pen. Okay. Oh, sorry, I guess I need to shrink it. So you can think about policy is going to directly affect the cases, growth rate of cases and deaths. For example, this is like or maybe you cannot see it, but mask policy. So that if there is a mandatory mask policy, the transmission per contact is going to decline. As a result, that's going to directly reduce the case growth. Okay. However, there are other effects of policy, okay, especially like stay at home. For example, stay at home policy is going to be not necessarily directly affect the case growth, but it's going to reduce the it's going to change the behavior. Okay, in our case, we're going to use a Google mobility measure so that people's mobility is going to decline when the stay-at-home order or shelter-in-place orders are implemented, and then decline in the mobility affects the outcome. So this is an indirect effect of policy through behavior. Okay, so that's how we're gonna think about. But in order to think about the dynamic effect, we actually have to think about another layer, which is information. Okay, so information, there are many different information, but the key information we're gonna think about is gonna be past cases and the past case growth. Okay, when the case growth is high or when the level of case is high, people is going to be very careful about going out or meeting people or keeping social distances, and they change the mobility measure. And as we see, in fact, we see that change in the mobility measure. Okay, but also that there are other latent behavior like washing hands and so on that is not necessarily captured the Google mobility, and that will affect the outcome. Okay, so that it's important to think about information coming out of the past outcome variable. Okay, that leads to, yes? So we can think about the behavior variable which we can observe in the data, such as Google mobility measure. And then there's a latent behavior, which itself is, this causal model doesn't distinguish necessarily about what we can observe or not. But when we bring it to the data, we have to actually think about what we can observe and what we cannot observe. And so that the interpretation of the coefficient, for example, in front of the information variable is going to represent the unobserved behavior, such as washing hands. Right. So that this causal model itself, or the framework itself, is think about how to interpret the regression results actually. Yeah, potentially. Yeah, but when we move to the actually what we do in the data, we have to interpret what it represents. Okay. Okay, and then finally we're gonna have a confounder. Okay, here one of the important confounder is gonna be, for example, the change in the test rates. Okay, so the more tests done, of course, that the confirmed case is gonna grow. If you ignore it, and then if cases are correlated with information, because government respond to the higher cases or higher growth leads to more tests. Well, I'm not sure that the U.S. government or Japanese government are clever enough to do it, but that could happen. Okay, so that we had to control for the confounder in that sense. For example, and that confounder we're going to consider is going to be state level characteristic and the mass dummy, and the interaction of the state level characteristic and mass dummy. Here, state level characteristic includes like a population, the area, so that the per capita density is going to be also captured. Okay. We have to be concrete about So this is a conceptual model. But we had to write it down the regression equation out of this. So here is a structural equation model, and yes. Yes, yes. So at this moment, until you write in a model and then they determine which variable you're going to use for information variable, you can also think about. For example, if you can, yeah, initially we are thinking about gathering Twitter data and those now cast type of data to get the information variable. We didn't pursue it because of the time constraint and so on. But potentially, of course, that you can add those news media and the report, first case report and so on as an additional information variable, because certainly that type of thing is going to affect the behavior, whatever you can measure. Here we're going to focus on Google mobility measure, but there's other type of the behavior variable. For example, there is a potentially you can use a mask wearing rate as a data, although that the daily data is hard to get, but for sure monthly data there is some survey, right? So that at this level of the generalization as a framework, you can bring whatever you like, okay? But this also whenever you bring it to the actual data and start running regression, you have to actually think about the latent behavior and then how to interpret the coefficient. Okay. Right. And then that we're going to bring, okay, still general thing, but we're going to impose the linearity and the orthogonality restriction. Okay. So this assumes that we have enough confound variable that will gives you enough control for the orthogonality condition holds. Okay. And then also we're going to impose the linearity here. Okay. So, but this is actually, this looks like a first stage and the second stage IB regression or mediation analysis has exactly this form. Okay. So let me explain. Okay. First, look at the first two equation. Okay. So this is the regression we're going to impose with particular choice of the behavior, policy, and outcome variable. Okay. So why is, for example, case growth? We do also the death growth too. Okay. But the case growth is going to be determined by the behavior variable. Here we're going to use a Google mobility measure. Okay. And then the bunch of different policy variables such as a mask policy, stay-at-home order, school closure, movie closure, restaurant closure, non-essential business closure. Okay. And in addition, there is potentially the information could directly affect outcome variable, but this might be interpreted as actually the latent behavior variable, which we don't fully observe, but information is going to affect the behavior. Okay. And then the control for those variables, we're going to impose the orthogonality condition that this error term is going to be orthogonal to behavior variable and policy variable, actually conditioning on the confounder variable. Okay. Now, then you can actually think about how second equation, how behavior is going to be determined by policy variable and the information variable as well as confounder. Okay. So this is going to be, looks like first stage IB regression, although we don't have a exclusion restriction, so it's more of the mediation analysis. Okay, but this is useful to think about direct effect versus indirect effect. Okay, so in particular, as you see, the policy is going to affect the behavior, and then behavior is going to affect the outcome. Okay, so this is a typical path causal path that lockdown policies such as school closure or stay-at-home order is going to affect the case growth. Okay. However, if you think about mask policy is not going to affect much of the behavior, okay, except for the mask behavior if you have a mask wearing rate as a behavior variable, but it's going to affect directly the outcome variable. Okay, so that's how we're going to think about. But you can also combine these two equations to have the so-called sort of reduced form type of equation, which is the third equation, which I call pi to y. Okay, so this is going to combine this basically drop the behavior variable, okay, and then it's going to affect the total effect of policy you can estimate by estimating the third equation. Okay, so we're going to actually estimate these three. Okay, and then actually you can do a Hausman type of test as a specification test to see that coefficient implied by from the first two equations is going to match up with the coefficient estimated in the third equation. Okay, and then system is over-identified. In particular, that the orthogonality condition with respect to the behavior variable in the first equation is going to give you the additional orthogonality condition. Okay. That's not all, because there is a dynamic feedback depending on which information variable we're going to pick. Okay, but in this context, I think the lagged case or death variables are going to be very important information variable, because that's going to change people's behavior even without implementing any policy. So if you think about Sweden's case or even Japanese case where there is no hardcore lockdown policy never implemented, okay, most of the policy is coming from state of emergency, which doesn't have any forceful lockdown. Okay, but people comply, probably partly because that people see the high number of cases and so on. Okay, so the information is important, and then the information is going to be fed in by the realized cases or death. Okay, so this leads to the dynamic feedback, and when we do counterfactual experiments, we have to take into account of this type of dynamic feedback, because just using the estimates and the coefficient to try to quantify the impact of certain counterfactual policy, that's going to miss the dynamic feedback. Okay, and then we see that if we do counterfactual experiments, that dynamic feedback is going to change the results, because even if you remove all lockdown policies, people react to the high number of cases and deaths, and then that will automatically reduce the case growth, although it's not as much as we hope. Okay. And then this is an important point, because at one of the discussion is that one of the discussion is that some paper claim that all the case change is going to be behavioral response, and lockdown policy did not play much of the role. Okay, so that's actually the one claim, and some claim, and many Twitter claims does that. Okay, especially in the U.S. So it's important to evaluate the relative importance of the voluntary response to the actual lockdown policy effect. Okay. I'm not going to spend time much on this, but we're just going to, okay? State here. Yeah, that's a possibility. We haven't investigated it given the time constraint, but that's certainly someone should definitely examine that. I was at one point thinking about even like thinking about distance from China or Wuhan by looking at, like, for example, the airline, whether they have a direct flight from Wuhan or not, or nearby China city. Okay, so those are the another things, right? But of course, you can think about whatever happened to the nearby states feed into as an information variable. Okay, and that leads to the actually the correlation. Even the error term correlation is potentially the problematic, which that leads to the actually the our inference being not as conservative as we should. Okay, so there's a multiple issue related to that, but we are not doing it in this paper, and somebody maybe want to do it to check. Okay. Yes. Yes, this is an important point. So there is like, so depends on the, but if you look at the literature, about like 11 days to the 2 weeks. And in fact, that yeah, people say that 2 weeks in Japan, right? It is some fixed number, right? There's a time lag because this is a confirmed cases, right? So behavior change, transmission change, they're like a 5 to 7 days incubation period where no symptom arise, and symptom arise, they get the test done, reporting lag, that add up to 2 weeks. Yeah, that's something we can check. We can check. Yeah, but yeah, um, yeah, could. Well, but if you look at the actually look at like recent end of June and July data, which I'm not going to discuss in this paper, which is something we are working on now. If you look at it, then look at the like a growth rate of cases and the time since mask policy has been implemented. The time matters in the opposite way, at least in the data. In the June, end of June to July, where some of the states has a very high case growths. Okay, so at least that in a 2 months, 3 months period in the U.S. data, which I don't discuss in this paper, but ongoing work we are working on, we actually see the opposite. Okay. All right. Okay. So given the limitation of time, I'm not going to talk about SAR model, but just point out our specification can be driven from the discrete time analog of the SAR model with testing added. Okay. In particular, okay, without going through the detail of the SAR model, we can think as infection rate, which is the key parameter to determine how fast the disease is going to spread in the SAR model. We can think infection rate is going to be determined by how many contact each people is going to have times conditioning on contact. What is the transmission probability? Okay, and then that how many contact people have is going to be affected by lockdown policies. Conditioning on contact, what is the transmission probability is going to be affected by mask policy. So that both is going to affect the infection rate. And so that's how we're going to think about deriving the empirical specification out of the SAR model. Okay. Importantly, that we had to adjust the growth rate of test in a case growth, but for death growth, we don't need to adjust the growth rate of test. Okay, in a simplest SAR model. Okay, so let's move on to the data. Okay. So we're going to use the data from March 7th to June 3rd. Before March 7th, there are many zero cases in across different states. So we minimize the log zero problem by starting from March 7th. And then we're going to end up with the June 3rd because we had to just fix the data at some point to write up the paper. Okay. And then daily cases and deaths is coming from New York Times, JHU, COVID tracking project. Those are the really well-known sources of the daily case and deaths. Number of tests are coming from COVID tracking project. US state policies are compiled by Lifeman et al. 2020. Behavior variables, we're going to focus on the variable coming out of the Google mobility reports, although there are other mobility measures such as UNAS, UNA, and SafeGraph, and so on. So there are other measures, but we're going to focus on Google mobility reports measure, which is something everybody can easily get access to. Okay. Importantly, we're going to use the 7 days moving average so that each data is actually a daily frequency. But because there is like a seasonality associated with days a week, and also that there's like a bunching in the reporting, on the reporting lag, that are somewhat stochastic in nature, so that we're going to take the 7 days moving average and use that as the daily data. Okay, that leads to the artificially created dependency over time, because I'm going to use the daily frequency data after taking a 7 days moving average, so that all the confidence intervals are constructed by state clustering, so taking into account of the dependency. Okay, so seasonality depending on the days of week is clear from this Google mobility measure. So this is the evolution of the transit station, the workplaces. We're going to also look at grocery as well as retail. Okay, so if you look at the transit, okay, in the mid-March, when the many states declared a state of emergency and then the closing the schools, mid-March, there's a sharp decline in the transit as well as workplaces. Okay, but as you see, the extent to which the change happens is different across states. Okay, and also that this is a pure data, so that especially like workplaces, of course, Sunday, Saturday, people do not go to work, many of them, so that there's a seasonality, and because we always take 7 days average, this seasonality does not matter. Okay, here is the 6 policy we're going to look at. Okay, so this reports the fraction of the states with each policy and how that change over time. Okay, a few things I want to say. Okay, if you look at these 4 policies, stay at home, closed movie theater, closed restaurant, closed business, they looks like highly correlated, and if you compute the correlation, it's highly correlated. However, mask policies are not. If anything, any results that are really robust for anything we do by changing the time period and adding a fixed effects and so on, the mask policy effect is very, very robust in this paper, even outside of the analysis we do. Okay. Other policy, there's a multi-collinearity, but the sum of the effect of those 4 policies down there, we believe we can estimate the sum of the effect. Okay. The difficulty of the estimating effect is really coming from the effect of closing school, which is an important issue. This is because in the US data, almost all the US states are closing school at the same time within a week. Okay. As a result, that we cannot estimate the school effect well, separately identified from the time effect, for example, the change in the national cases. So if we add the national growth of the cases and national cases as an information variable, the school coefficient changes dramatically, because it's very difficult to separate the effect of school from the aggregate time effect. Okay, but other policies can be estimated. Okay. So this is just correlation metrics, which try to repeat what I just said. Okay, mask policy is gonna be relatively low correlation. It still has a high correlation with some of the policy variable, but relative to the other policies correlation, it's much lower. So that currently we are writing another paper by looking at May, June, July. Then the really correlation is almost zero or even negative, and still we find the mask effect. So we are very comfortable to say that mask effect is well identified, separate from other policy effects. Okay, mask effects also correlate with the other Google measure, behavior variable, but correlation is much less relative to the other policy measure, because the other policy measure is basically lockdown policies, try to reduce the movement. But mask, well, there's a time series correlation, but mask does not necessarily affect people's behavior. Yes? Oh, yeah, I have to be careful here. So I'm particularly looking at mask mandates policy for employees in public-facing businesses like retail and so on. Okay, I'm not looking at the mask mandatory policy for public places in general. Although that the timings are very similar, so that it's hard to distinguish, but just looking at this, we found the effect, okay, which is, I think, interesting and maybe important, because at least some Americans could accept the mask for employees in public facing business. That policy could be more complied, but the other public, if the state government require everybody to wear in public places, I think that the compliance is going to be low in some places. Okay. Here is a simple graphical evidence. Okay, so we are comparing the mean of the case grosses on the left panel between the states that implement the mask mandates, which is a blue line, and the states that have not implemented mask mandates. So apparently the case growth is lower among the states that implement mask mandates. Okay, similar pattern happens in death growth, although it's much noisier. So this is a problem. I mean, the death is potentially more accurate because case is just confirmed case. Okay, so that some people say we should only look at death, but the flip side of the death, looking at death, is death is much noisier. Okay, because there's a time lag and so on. Okay, so there is like advantage and disadvantage of looking at the case and death. Okay, yes. Oh, that's so we could potentially adjust excess death or look at the excess death, which we haven't done. Okay, potentially. This is really reported as COVID-19 related deaths. But in the United States, we have evidence that there is a systematic excess deaths. That's something we could do, or somebody else can do. Okay. All right, regression analysis. So we're gonna, using this data, we're gonna regress and estimate these three equations. In the interest of time, we're not gonna talk too much about each of the estimates, except for a few things, because that table is going to be big and long. We're going to just focus on the punchline. So we're going to focus on like behavior variable, policy variable, and each of the regression. And then in particular, we are interested in the total effect. Okay, and the total effect of policy can be computed using directly this so-called reduced form equation estimates, or you estimate the first two equations and then get the alpha, pi, beta, and then compute the total effect. But when you do, when you look at the estimate the first two equations separately, we have estimate of alpha and pi and beta. So we can actually separate the total effect between the indirect effect and the direct effects. Okay, indirect effect is gonna be alpha times beta. So this is an indirect. So we can see that some of the policy, like lockdown policies, mostly coming from indirect effects. Other policies like mask are gonna be direct effect. Okay, so rather than reporting big table, let me just give you the sort of the punchline of the policy effects. Okay, here we're gonna focus on 3 policies, although there are other policies like closure of movie theater, restaurant, non-essential businesses. Okay, so the important thing is a mask for employees policies. Okay, as you see, the total effect. So if you estimate the first 2 equation, the coefficient in front of policy. So let me see. So we are looking at the this equation, and then conditioning on behavior variable, what is the effect of policy? So that already the Google mobility measures condition on. Okay, and then we see that mask policy is going to be mostly directly affecting because it does not affect the behavior much, and however, that reducing the transmission risk per contact, and that leads to the decline in case growth. Okay, you can also estimate it directly, the third equation, to get the total effect of the mask policy. And computing either way, we're going to have a very similar estimate, so about minus 0.08 to minus 0.09. So that about 8 to 9% decrease in the growth rate of cases, which is actually substantial if you take into account of a cumulative effect on the deaths and the cases. Okay, so you can actually compare these two to do the Hausman type of test for this particular coefficient, and then that there's no significant differences, so that this actually gives you a specification test. Now, the school closure turns out to have a very, very big effect estimated when we don't control for national case as an information variable. Okay, so we exclude the national case growth and national log cases from the regression. Then the school closure is estimated a very big number. Okay, but however, there's some evidence that this might not be a correct specification because that depends on how you do it. The first 2 equations have a very different coefficient than just estimating third equation directly. So that if you think about Hausman-like test, then there's like indication that the specification might not be correct. Okay, stay at home order is estimated about 10% or 11%, which is again substantial, which could be a believable number. Okay, what I'd like to highlight here is if you're gonna do the same thing with national case variable as an information, so that we're gonna control for the sort of time effect through a change in the national cases, then suddenly school coefficient becomes 0. Okay, this is because that when school policy is implemented, simultaneously, national cases is gonna really increase a lot. So it's coincide with the increase in the national cases. So we cannot distinguish between the school closure effect, or people realize that nationally in the US, cases shoot up so that people become more careful about behavior. Okay. Yeah, we always have it. Okay. Right. Let me jump into here. Okay. Given the time. So this is the first equation. Sorry, it's very small. So let me actually make it bigger. How can I? Yeah. Somehow it doesn't react. Okay. So this is whoop. Close up. Okay, so this is regressing the case growth on policy variable and behavior variable and information variable. Okay, so this is Yamaguchi-san's question. So as you see, the past cases have a negative coefficient in a case growth. Okay, so the interpretation of this is that as the cases rises, people start becoming very careful about more frequently washing hands, keeping social distances, or not even get out of home. Okay, those are not necessarily fully captured by Google mobility measure. Okay, and as a result, it's going to show up as a coefficient of the cases. So this is a state level cases. And then this negative sign, which we're going to find in the Japanese case too, has a very important implication on the dynamics where we do counterfactual experiments. Okay, national cases also has a negative coefficient, even larger one. Okay, this one is going to be a little tricky to think about whether it's really captured the information or some other observed time varying state level variable. Okay, all right, so that's a nice question. All right. The one thing I want to say, another thing I want to say is, so if I estimate the third equation, and the one thing we did was we separate the mask policy effect between the April and the May. And then we found that the mask effect is bigger, larger in April. So one way to interpret it is that even the United States, in May, many people start wearing masks, even without mandatory policy. So that is why we believe that we found a lower effect in May than April, because in April, not many people wear the mask, so that the mandatory policy had an impact in the sense that more people wear the mask. But in May, people already started voluntarily wearing masks, so that the effect is lower. So for example, if the Prime Minister Abe started to introduce mandatory mask policy in Japan, we don't think there's any effect, right? Because people are already wearing masks. So that similar thing happened, I think, in the United States. Yeah, I think we unless we do we look at the correlation, we cannot tell. But so we cannot tell, right? But at least there's some indication. Okay. For example, that second equation, maybe if you do bootstrap, we might have a statistical differences. Okay. Okay, so let me move on to the counterfactual, given that I have 10 minutes for this US case, and I would like to move on to the more interesting Japanese case, at least for the audience. Okay. So fit of the estimated and observed growth. So this is just estimates the model and feed in the covariates to get the y hat, and then look at how y hat matches with observed growth rate. Notice that right-hand variable is always evaluated at the 2 weeks before, so that we can actually use this model for prediction purpose, okay? Which later we're gonna talk about for the Japanese case, okay? But bottom line here, fit is good, reasonably good at the state level, okay? Then we wanna do a counterfactual experiment. So first experiment we're gonna do is that what if all the US states start mandatory mask policy on April 1st, okay? No US states had implemented mandatory mask policy on April 1st yet, okay? But there's emerging evidence that the mask might actually is very useful to prevent from spreading, okay? So that here we are thinking about the counterfactual of this red line, so that proportion of the states on April 1st is going to jump up to 1, okay? And then relative to the effect of what happened, so that we are trying to evaluate the impact of this, okay? So first look at some concrete states. This is the Washington states, okay? So implementing on April 1st, the effect, there's a time lag, okay? It takes 2 weeks to get the effect, okay? Which is an important point because there's an information lag in the 2 weeks. So that 2 weeks, if you got the case growth like 100%, you got 200% more roughly in the 2 weeks. So it's very important to keep in mind for the policymaker that it takes 2 weeks, whatever you do in the policy effect, okay? And then, so that the impact is going to realize. So this is like a relative change in the case growth between the counterfactual states and what actually happened. So that there's a decline in the third week. There's a decline in the case growth by about 0.1, which is represented by the coefficient of the mask policy. Okay, and then interestingly, there is a decline in the impact of reducing the cases after that. So this is really coming through the voluntary behavioral change. What do you mean? Well, so mask leads to the lower case growth, okay, by 10%, which is big. Now people see the news that, okay, so now cases going down, so people become more reckless. They're not going to be as careful as before. That leads to the voluntary increase in the cases because now they go out more, and then they don't wash hands as much. Okay, so this is voluntary. In Washington State, the mandatory face mask is going to be introduced around beginning of May, so that there's an overshoot because now that the case is much lower than it should, so that this overshoot is representing the mandatory face mask policy is going to be now implemented. Okay. So what if all U.S. states implemented this mandatory mask policy? So this is important to get some numbers for the impact of how many saved life. Okay, so this is what you can do, and then there's you do it state by state and then take an average to look at how the change in the case growth. But the case growth implies the case numbers. Okay, as in the always the sum order has this exponential growth, but here exponential growth is not going to happen because of the voluntary change in the behavior. However, the number of cases impact is going to be large. In particular, if you look at the cases, you are looking at the relative decline in the cases is going to be about 10% to 45%. I think I have a death. So I repeated the same exercise, taking the outcome variable for death growth as outcome variable, and repeat everything. Okay, so this is based on the estimate using the death growth, and then we get something like 17% to 55%, okay, decline in deaths nationally. Okay, by the end of May, about 100,000 deaths happened in the whole U.S. So that gives you the estimate of 70,000 to 55,000 saved lives if all U.S. states adopted the mandatory mask on April 1st. Okay, so and then it's so that the mask effect is relatively well identified, so that even using cases or deaths, whichever outcome you use, you got the very similar numbers. Okay, and then notice that mask policy in terms of economic cost is much less than the other lockdown policy like closure of school or closure of the businesses. So I think that given these estimates and given that a lot of evidence that face mask policy, mandatory face mask policy is worthwhile policy to pursue. Okay. We can also evaluate the other lockdown policies effect. Okay, for example, here, no stay-at-home order policy. So suppose that, so the stay-at-home order, many states adopted stay-at-home order policies in the late March to the beginning of April. Okay, and then we're going to consider the counterfactual of the no state implemented stay-at-home order. And the question is, how many more Americans have been implemented without these policies? Okay. Counterfactual effect of no stay-at-home orders is going to be about the case would have been larger by 25 to 170%. Okay. If we translate this into the deaths, it's going to be 25,000 to 170,000 deaths. Or if you look at the infections, 0.5 to 3.4 million more infections. So it's substantial, of course. This is the nature of the SAR model, where that the exponential growth is gonna gives you the growing cases. Although in this model, it's gonna be much less predicted than some of the simulated model, simulated SAR model, because of voluntary reduction in behavior changes. We also did force ourselves to do the removing all policies, but there's a lot of uncertainty associated with the impact of the removing all policy. This is really coming out of the uncertainty in the effect of school closure. Okay, so this is a sense to which the it's very difficult to identify, but there could be the school closure effect. Okay, so this is a repeating the same simple exercise, comparing closed states and the non-closed states. Okay, so the this very narrow window of 1 week, there is a difference in the growth rate of the cases and deaths between the states that closed the schools and the state that didn't. Okay, so there is some evidence, and then that the magnitude is big. However, it's hard to distinguish with aggregate time effects. And then this is a very important point, and this is really a lot of ongoing debate going on this topic, and then nobody knows. I don't think there's any convincing study on the school effect of school closing effect. Okay, and then of course people got a sense that transmission rate is much lower among children. However, it's not zero, and then contact rate is high among school. Everybody meet to each other, so we don't know the sum of the effect. And then the children could transmit to parents, although again some evidence suggests it's lower rate, but still non-zero, and we don't know how much of the effect is going to be. In fact, the Japan closed school earlier than other countries may contribute to the lower growth rates in Japan. We just don't know. And that's really important research topic if somebody can find out how to do it. And yeah, of course we are trying to do it in a different way now, but okay. So rather than conclude, let me move on to the Japan case. And it's likely I'm gonna end up with a little bit of time before 30 minutes, because this is very preliminary. Okay, so so basically what I did was ask one of the graduate students, Kisho Hoshi, who is a very, very good student. I shouldn't say student. He is actually a researcher, and he's going to be a PhD student at the UBC. I successfully recruited him. Okay, and then started to work on it on this topic. Okay, so let's move on to how the similar measure is going to look like in Japan. Okay. So this is a Google measure index. So rather than looking at the 4 different measures of the workplace, retail, grocery, transit, just to simplify, because the number of observation turns out to be very, very small, smaller than US states in Japan for various reasons. I'm just going to look at the Google Mobility Index. That is just the average of the 4 Google Mobility measure. Okay, so this Google Mobility Index is going to represent the percentage decline the visit and the frequency to some of those places like workplaces, retail, grocery, and transit. Here I just look at the 4 prefecture in Kanto area. Okay, Chiba, Kanagawa, Saitama, Tokyo, because there are many cases reported in these places. Okay, so apparently the March we didn't see much of the decline in the mobility. Okay, there's a little bit of more voluntary one, but as soon as the state of emergency is implemented, declared, people started declining. But also there's like a golden week effect. Well, golden week effect is a little late. No, relative to the January and the February. Okay, but I don't think even if we do year by year, it wouldn't matter. But the Google doesn't have that data anyway, or doesn't publish it. Okay, so there's a golden week effect, but more importantly, state of emergency effect is going to kick in here. Okay, and then gradually the mobility is increasing. Okay. How about the case growth? Now, case growth, partly because the test hasn't been done as well as we hope in Japan early March. It's very noisy, especially in March and April. Okay. However, later it gets settled down. Still, it's a little fluctuate because the number of cases is smaller. Okay. Even if we take the 7 days moving average to compute the case growth, we still have a noisy things. Okay. But we see the pattern as similar to the movement to the Google mobility measure. In fact, in this graph, I actually put the Google mobility measure by moving 2 weeks later, so that we are implicitly looking at how the Google mobility measure 2 weeks ago match up with the case growth in Japan among those 4 prefectures. As you see, looks like there is high correlation, at least over time. Okay, which is like starting point, I think. And as we see that this gives us the estimated coefficient of the Google mobility measure on the case growth as expected. Okay. You can actually look at the different prefectures to see that how do the two-way plot of the weekly case growth is against 2 weeks before Google Mobility Index. Okay, as you see, there's like a positive correlation, and then looking at the time series data for each prefecture, you can run the regression to see that you can identify the relationship between Google Mobility measure 2 weeks ago and weekly case growth. Okay, and then every time series you're gonna do, you're gonna have a positive relationship. And then the Tokyo is the highest in terms of the out there. Okay, so this one is Tokyo. Of course, whether we can interpret this causal or not is a tricky thing. Although once you recognize that it's 2 weeks before, maybe it might not be bad, given that people are not gonna think about or accurately predict 2 weeks later's case growth. Okay, so that it might not be so bad. Okay, what I'd like to do is first just to make a point of the how to use our estimated model to make a prediction, and then the informed decision about the policy and so on. Later we're gonna do the same prediction exercise using the estimated model, but here I'm going to just use this correlation interpreted as a way to predict the future case growth. I'm gonna make a prediction based on back of envelope calculation using this correlation. Okay, so if you look at the Google mobility index in the beginning of July or end of June in Tokyo, it's about minus 20%. Okay, so if you evaluate average Google mobility measure and then the predicted weekly growth rates in Tokyo, it's gonna be 0.5. Okay, so that means if you take this as a way to predict future case growth, we're gonna have a 50% more in 1 week. This is very, very simple but powerful back of envelope prediction. Later, we're gonna do a little bit better version of it using estimate model. Okay, so that means, so now the Google data we have is only up to July 7th. So we're gonna just take the daily cases up to July 7th, so that the weekly average of daily cases in Tokyo was 110. Okay, and then if you fill in the 50% growth, then we predict the number of daily cases between July 8 and 14 is going to be 165. We might overshoot that, but may not be so far away because last three days we have a high number, but turns out before that we got very low number. So maybe this might not be so off. Okay, but this model predicts up to 2 weeks later, so that 50% growth happen even two weeks later. This leads to 250 cases on average between July 15 and 21st. Okay, we might overshoot that, we don't know, but that's approximately what this implies. And then this is entirely predicted by the Google mobility measure. Okay, but it may be so far off. Okay, we can do a little bit better by estimating the model we estimate using US data. Okay, so for that we need to collect the provincial government policies and then collect other necessary information. So this is some government policy at the provincial level. So I think what everybody is familiar with is a state of emergency. Okay, when people think about policy, that's the policy people think about. Okay, however, different government turns out impose slightly different policy, like a museum closure or nightclub closure. Maybe nightclub closure has to be implemented in Tokyo, I don't know, but it's not. And so what we do was, because the state of emergency is very powerful, but there's not much of variation across prefectures, we're gonna just take these three measures and take the simple weighted average to create policy index. Okay, and then use this as a policy measure, and then repeat the exercise we have done in the US. So data we use was from March 1st to July 7th. And then there's one very important issue when you do this regression. The issue is that many prefectures have a very small number of cases. And it's very difficult to compute case growth. Okay? And that was a very important issue, and we don't know what to do with it. And we eventually decided to drop the many prefectures that have many 0 cases. Okay, so in fact, the measure is like based on the weekly cases. So we are actually summing up cases across week. But turns out, really many prefectures have a period where there is no cases for 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, so in that case, we decided to drop it. So that, as you see, most of the prefecture we're going to use is going to be the large and the populated prefecture. Okay. And then there's a daily cases reported in some places. Number of tests, Toyo case, and maybe many of you know, has test data as well as cases data. Policy index is computed as a state of emergency plus museum plus nightclub. So that each has a dummy variable, so it can take 0, 1/3, and 2001. Okay, mobility index is going to be just average of the 4 Google measure, but instead of percentage, I'm going to divide it by 100, so that the coefficient is easier to interpret. Okay, and then the order measure is going to be originally daily measure, but I'm going to take a 7 days moving average for the same reason we discussed before. Okay. So we have estimated, and here it's a very small number of regressors, so we can report the results, which is now we skipped in a previous US case because it's too complicated. So this is how the Google Mobility Index as a dependent variable is going to be affected by policy index and then the information. Okay. So importantly, the policy seems to be negatively affect mobility because this is a lockdown policy, and then everybody knows state of emergency had an impact on behavior. Not many people are going out during that period. Of course, there's always an issue about the how to separate time effects. Okay, but if you include the national cases, this policy index coefficient decline, but not so much. Okay, here we're going to have a observed prefecture variable such as area and the population, and then the interaction with mass dummy. So at least part of the time effect is controlled. We also estimated how the case growth is affected by Google mobility as well as directory policy. But here we find that changing the Google mobility measure seems to have explanatory power on the case growth. So that is what we found casually from these plots. Okay, we are doing regression version of this. Okay, right. So with this, we can actually measure the policy effects because the policy, policy will affect Google mobility measure. And then Google mobility measure is going to affect cases. So we can actually compute the policy effects here. Okay. And one more thing, important thing is that the past cases turns out to have an important explanatory power on the case growth. So this is this imply, at least my interpretation is that other than Google mobility measure, there is a many latent behavior we don't observe in the data. Okay, but like when the cases grow, Japanese people is going to be more careful about the social distancing, or wear a mask, or washing hands, simply do not meet people much. Okay, and that reduces the cases. Okay, and then this has an important dynamic effect because that current case is going to become an information and will affect the 2 weeks later the cases again. Okay. All right. So now, okay, so I got 15 more minutes, but I'm going to be almost done. So we're going to do the same exercise of the prediction and then try to think about how useful this type of model is to think about policy and the current situation. Okay, so this is a fit of the model in Tokyo. So the blue line is the observed case growth, and the red line is going to be the y hat implied by the previous regression. Okay, and the fit is not bad. Okay, important thing is that maybe I should use different color. we have an extra 2 weeks of the prediction in terms of growth rate, because the model is gonna predict 2 weeks later as case growth. Okay, so even if the data is available up to July 7th, we have 2 more weeks of prediction. We can use this to predict the Tokyo cases in 1 week and 2 weeks. Importantly, there is a declining in the case growth, and this is really coming from negative coefficient of cases. Okay, so that the recently case increased, we are feeding the observed cases, and then at the late June and the beginning of July, the people see the higher case growth. That will lead to the predicted value of the cases lower, because we predict people become more careful according to these estimates. Okay, so that is why, remember, we are feeding the actual observed case growth on the level of cases. Now everybody know beginning of July, Tokyo case level increased. And the model predict people become more careful. And case growth decline. So as a result, if you, based on this prediction, based on the estimated model, we can do a prediction of the cases. All right, so as before, the daily case is going to be 110. 1 week later, 160. 2 weeks later, 210. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, turns out that the growth rate between these two is going to be declining. Okay, so we have 210. Now, if you use simple correlation like that without behavior response, we tend to overpredict 250, because we don't take into account people become careful. Okay, so according to this model, prediction of the cases from July 15 to July 2021 is 210. Well, if you look at the last 3 days statistics, which is above 200, we might actually overshoot. All right, so I am not insisting this estimate model is correct or have a very accurate prediction, but I believe this number provide a benchmark number to think about what's going on now. If we see the larger number than this in the next week, on average, this means people are not as careful as model predicts. So the fact, well, we don't know yet, but if we see 300 average in the next week in Tokyo, policymaker be very careful, might be concerned, because people are not reacting voluntarily enough, so that case might not reduce through voluntary reaction as model predicts. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say was, I think this model is useful as a benchmark. And then whether prediction is right or not, the gap itself is one very important information policymakers should utilize, because that is going to represent how people are voluntarily careful about transmission risk. Okay, so that's a sort of the, I guess, the current punchline of this paper. We are actually thinking about doing counterfactual. We are also thinking about bringing like a prefecture characteristics such as telework index and so on, to see the heterogeneous impact of the Google mobility measure of the policies in the Japanese cases now, but we haven't done that yet. And so that, but I think bottom line is clear that looks like Google mobility index is useful to predict the case growth. Okay, and then also we found some evidence that lockdown policies have reduced the growth rate of cases through reducing people's mobility. Okay, there's one caveat that once you control for national cases, the impact of lockdown policies is substantially reduced in the estimates, so that there's a lot of uncertainty, just as in the case of the effect of the school enclosure in the US case. There's a lot of uncertainty in the policy effect. But I think that the impact of the change in mobility measure on the case growth is solid. Okay. And I believe also that estimated model is useful for prediction, but more useful to monitor how fast cases may grow and how that's going to reveal that how people has been responding to the cases in the past. Okay, and then the gap between the predicted number from this model and the actual number we see, if the gap is larger, policymakers should be careful. And then last two things, which is like implication in a broad sense, is that it's clear that policy that encourage people's mobility may increase the spread of COVID-19. So maybe we should think about go-to campaign. Well, everybody thinks so, I think. And also, as I honestly believe that one of the big reasons why Japan has so low cases, despite the policies, type of the policy implemented, is that people wear a mask. Maybe BCG plays some role, but the people wearing mask, but it's summer, so it's going to be very uncomfortable. But beware that if you don't wear, well, I can say that because I'm not in Tokyo, maybe. If you don't wear a mask, you might potentially spread the disease. And then the way I see it is that Japanese people have a herd immunity because everybody wear the mask. You lose herd immunity once you don't wear the mask, so keep wearing the mask. Okay, so that's it, I think, today talk. Yeah. Yeah. So interestingly, maybe so idiosyncratic testing frequency and so on, or maybe reporting issue. Yeah, it's very somewhat strange. And yeah, I mean, this is really different from US because the number of tests done per million is very, very different and much larger in the US, especially the latter period. But in Japan, I think it's small. And then when it's small, the growth rate of test it's fluctuate a lot. And then that's probably the reason why. So that and then I have to emphasize that the estimation we are doing is going to be growth rate. So it's going to be like, it's not the level, it's a growth. When you're trying to estimate the growth rate equation, when you have zero case in the level, the computing growth rate is very noisy. And then I think that contributes to this. Maybe if I focus on the more subset of the prefecture like Tokyo and then like 5 prefecture that is the biggest, maybe we find some positive or negative number here. But in this case, we could use a little bit more, but we only use here 3 because no, there's no reason. So initially we didn't want to use too many of them because we knew that they are correlated and they were not well identified, so that we decided to just pick 2. And then the last night or a day before, actually this is like 2 days of work. Given that we wanted to do it, yeah, I realized that, well, because the number of observations is small, we should really summarize the policy, and then that the available code only uses three policy, but we can definitely use other policy measure because the Hoshi-san compiled two or three more policy measure by himself. Yeah. Oh, you have it. Okay. You have, or did you work with Hoshi-san separately? Oh, then we should compare. Yeah. Oh, right. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so then I'm gonna send you well, Hoshi-san is gonna send you. You can talk that. Well, you cannot directly talk to Hoshi-san maybe now. uh, yeah, we're gonna send you a data and then let's compare. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we don't have a data, right? Well, we have a yeah. There is a data, survey data. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. No, 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 no. I definitely the Japan is not gonna be the. I'm not the. See the title. Title. There is no mask. Yes. Yeah. So that's the possibility we are thinking. The only issue is that the spottiness of data in terms of time over time. So it's not gonna be a precise, but we can still do some, right? So that there is we are aware of the YouGov. This is an England company have collected the data state level, and then I actually sent the email, and but they, as far as we are aware of, they only have probably once a month at the best uh, wearing rate, but at least we have a cross sectional states, and then the rough time over time change. So that is actually a B variable, but behavior variable for the mask effect. And that would be nice if we can do it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cross country data is interesting. And in fact, there is already a cross country study that how mask wearing rate is going to affect, well, it's not here. Um, yeah, so that survey using this Miyazawa and the Kaneko paper actually exactly look at that for cross country data. Yeah, yeah, of course. I'm available. Yeah, thank you.